How do you create a culture in your practice and have CAs follow what you want them to do, but also at the same time have the sense that they have a bit of ownership of actually wanting to do what's right for the company without you having to be, dictating, watching everything that they have to do? Well, it's a trick and it's hard to do. So let's dive into and talk about what are some of the things that I think you need to have to create a culture where your CA has buy-in, but also at the same time, they also have a bit of autonomy to help you build the practice that you want to have. So let's get right on to the show. Hey there, I'm Laurence Tham here from your Chiro Coach. Now, today's episode, we're going to be talking a lot about building CA cultures. It's not easy. It's definitely a very difficult thing, especially when we're dealing with human beings. And building a culture requires time and effort. So that's the key element I think you need to kind of take away from, is that there is no magic bullet. There's not one thing you say or one thing you do that's also magically appear that these CAs are just going to follow your instructions. They have to require you to have time and patience. I almost think like it's very similar to how you raise kids in a way. Not that CAs are kids, so don't be offended if you're a CA. It's more like it's about really taking time and understanding that this is a process and the CA need to get used to you and to the culture you're trying to build. But you also have to be patient to allow the CAs to make mistakes and learn how to fail. This is no different, by the way. You can interchange CA and associate here, but the culture is the key matter, the key element here that you need to kind of consider. So what are we really talking about? Well, first of all, the assumption I'm making, right, that is probably for another video, is that you've hired appropriately. Okay, that's number one. If you don't hire the right CA or the right associate or the right team member, then, well, you're going to have a harder road to climb. So let's start with that premise that you've hired correctly and you've hired for the right personality and characteristic for that particular role and responsibility you want them to make. The second assumption that I'm also making is that you actually have created certain vision and values within your practice, because that's another video that we need to talk about at another point, that you actually have to have a certain vision for your practice and you have to have certain values that your practice upholds and live by. So what are we deciding to do? How do you form culture? Well, form culture requires, I believe, there's 3 steps. Number one is you have to, well, first of all, have them, right? You need to create them. Second of all, you need to communicate them. And thirdly, you have to be consistent with them. So let me repeat that. You need to create them. You need to be able to communicate them. And number 3, you need to be able to be consistent with them, which means that you have to be consistently monitoring and also communicate and making sure that the CAs and the team members and everybody on your team have a buy-in to that particular values that you actually uphold. If you don't, well, you're basically thinking that I said it once, so therefore you should know it. That's a really terrible idea. The third part, the consistency part, is where most people fail. Most people have a vision or values. Actually, not many people do, but let's assume that they do. Second, they communicate, but they don't necessarily communicate it very well. And thirdly, they don't consistently reinforce it because, well, let's face it, they think it's an exercise we do once. But again, that's another video. So here's the thing that we need to consider here, is that we need to consider this particular area. So what I want you to kind of consider here is, let me just kind of get rid of this here and that. Let me just get rid of that background. So I think one of the most crucial element here is that you have to really dive into a certain element. And the element is that there's 2 structures, because it's a really balancing act, right? The balancing act is between trying to figure out is how do you kind of discuss with your CAs to have a strict regimen of exactly what the culture needs to be or the values they hold, but also at the same time, that making sure that you're going to create a little bit of flexibility, now enough flexibility that they feel like you're not always dictating how it's going to be, because you don't want to be authoritative, but you don't want to just give them full freedom to do whatever they want, because I think both ends don't work, right? So you have to be restrictive and strict. At the same time, you have to be flexible. And this kind of came up with one of my clients today, and I thought this will be a great conversation to hear. So let's kind of dive into what you need to kind of consider. Balancing those 2 things, right? Balancing those 2 things I think we need to consider is that first of all, I think you need to have some restrictive boundaries. And these restrictive boundaries is really important. These restrictive boundaries are sort of like, these are your no-go zone. You can't cross it. These are, I believe, what's important here is that those are our values, right? These are our values that we uphold within this practice. And if you want to live, if you want to work here, you want to function here and be successful here, you need to live by these values. And these values are non-negotiable. And so it could be like, for example, is that we're all in this together. We treat each other like family, or experience matters, that we're always constantly getting better. Now, if that is not a value you uphold, then unfortunately you're maybe not suitable for this company, or you're not suitable for this company. And you need to make the judgment call to make sure you let someone go before it actually gets out of hand. And that's on you though, right? Unfortunately, most people are too afraid to do that. But the reality is, if you're trying to build a culture, you got to have the right people in on the bus, right? You got to have the right people in the practice to really build that culture. If you don't, if you let it slip away at the beginning, then this is never going to work. So it starts from the beginning. So you have to have strict boundaries of exactly what is expected of each of your team members, and those values is what's going to dictate these boundaries. But at the same time, inside those boundaries is that you want to kind of create flexibility that they can really kind of be autonomous to be able to create the how. And this autonomy is that you want to be able to have flexibility in their job. That basically, what I mean by that, here's their values, right? Here's our values of what we're going to do. This is what I expect of you. But at the same time, I'm going to allow you the flexibility to figure out how to do that. So for example, if my value is that we create the best exceptional experiences, we have to create exceptional experiences for our patients or for our clients. How you do that, that's going to be up to you. And I'm going to leave that up to your discretion. And so now you can obviously give examples, but if you tell them exactly how to do it, like step by step, like this is what you need to do here, here, and here, and here, that becomes more authoritative, which means that you don't give them the autonomy to think for themselves. Now, that may be helpful to tell them exactly what to do, but if you don't give any flexibility, then how is the CA or the associate ever going to be able to think for themselves? They're just going to follow these rules. Now, that may work in certain circumstances, but I can tell you that that's never going to get them thinking outside the box, right? So you can see there is a box here, right? But it's about thinking inside that box. What you don't want to end up doing is being so restrictive that you sort of create a secondary box inside that box and they can't get out of it. And that could be a problem. And that's the reality of what we're trying to talk about here, is that in order for you to build culture within your practice, is that yes, you do have to have restrictive boundaries, because otherwise it will be out of control. But at the same time, within those boundaries, you want to have that flexibility. So for example, if the boundaries is that you value that people are going to, show up on time, right, and be there on time, then the reality is that they have to show up on time. Like, that's the thing, is non-negotiable. But you need to nip that in the bud right at the beginning if they don't show up on time. But the reality is that, how early you show up, that's up to you. But just as long as you be there for 8 o'clock, before 8 o'clock is fine. You want to be there for 15 minutes before 8 o'clock, then it's fine. But maybe it's between, maybe you don't want them to be there 15 minutes before. You may put something between 15 minutes before 8 o'clock, that anytime there's fine. So there's that flexibility. I know that's a very crude, very simplistic example, but the key element here is that you need to know what your boundaries are, and each practice is going to be different. I can't tell you what they are because it's your practice. You have certain values that I may not value, and I have certain values that you may not value. So you have to create these values to define the boundaries, and then also allow the autonomy to allow your CAs and your associates to be able to figure out the logistics of figuring out how to do that. Now, that's going to take some teasing, which means that they're not always going to choose right? What I mean by that is that there are other actions and behavior within that builds boundaries are not always going to be correct. So therefore, it's your responsibility as the principal to make sure that you have communicate to them why that isn't the way we do things here, and here's how I would do it differently. And they need to understand that, and you can't just let it go. So just like, let's use the example of being late. If they're being late the first time, he goes like, so sorry, the traffic was bad. And the second time they go, well, listen, I'm sorry, the alarm bell didn't go. And the third time, and all this continue to happen, you don't say anything. What is that going to tell them? Unconsciously, your team member is going to think, well, that's not really that important. He doesn't really care that much, or he or she doesn't care that much. So therefore, it's like, don't worry, we can get away with that. And if that's really important, that's going to irk you, and that's going to annoy you, and then you're going to blame them for a whole bunch of other things that what you're really annoyed about is them being late. So the thing is that what you got to do is you got to address it right away. You got to go, hey, listen, right? He goes, when you are late, what it makes me feel is that it makes me feel like you don't care about this job, or what it makes me feel is that you're not attentive into details. And how that impacts me is that makes me feel like you're not going to be, that you're not paying attention to all the other things that I want you to do, right? And what that does is it lets them know that you're making them accountable. And if you don't have accountability in what they do, that creates a really bad culture. And a lot of things, if you evaluate in your current practice and the way your current culture is or lack of, it's usually due to things you never addressed in the first place because you're too afraid of it, because you don't want conflict, you don't want to lose your staff, and so on and so forth. But the problem is the longer you don't address something, just like any relationship in the world, if the longer you don't address it, it becomes a big thing. And this big thing becomes like a massive thing. And that's how blow up occurs. This is how people get fired, or people don't care about the practice, and they start, being disgruntled. This is what happens, is that because we let little things get to a big thing, and the big thing becomes a massive thing. So my encouragement is that if you want to build culture, you got to start from the beginning, which means that you hire well, you go, this is the rules and these are the regulations of what we're working from, and here's how we do things, and course correct along the way. I have total flexibility within the context of the values in my team, and they're able to be flexible during those moments. But the reality is that they have to know and be accountable when their mistakes are made. I don't care that my team that makes mistakes. And the very first job, all my team members, when they first started, I encourage them to make mistakes, because they only going to learn because of those mistakes. But don't ignore the mistakes. I want you to tell me when you make those mistakes, so I know how I can help you course correct them. I will let you know when you make those mistakes. And reality is that they need to come to me when there's a problem, when they don't know how to solve things. Don't try to solve it on your own without help, because at the beginning, it takes time. And so if you're expecting to build culture within a week or a month or 3 months, that's not going to happen. Culture is established over a long period of time, and it's got to be reinforced over a long period of time. We're talking months and years. And so therefore, if you really want a strong foundation, if you want a strong practice overall, you got to play the long game, which means that you have to establish a culture for years. And the thing is that once you establish a really strong culture, when you bring in someone new, they're going to adapt to the strong culture. But if you have a loose culture and you bring someone in, they're going to think that there's a loose culture, so it's a free-for-all. And that's usually what the problems lie. So you need to start now. If you haven't started, you need to start thinking about building that strong culture now, because it's never too late. It's never too soon to establish a culture, but be patient. That's the most important thing. So I hope this has been helpful to you. Remember, you can sign up and watch these on YouTube. You can watch these on Facebook. And of course, you can actually also download the podcast of Your Chiro Coach. So search that up. And of course, please join us on the Chiro Think Tank Facebook group that we have. We actually will put some of these information in there exclusively there, but also they will also be the first ones to kind of get exclusive videos and content. All right, we'll talk to you soon. I hope this is valuable to you. Please comment and like this video and share it with others that you think will matter to their particular team.